So in a minute, we'll ask them to share their thoughts on what makes Bell Labs unique. So here we go, Bob. There we go. And how it has impacted their life. But let me introduce each of them. So here to my right is Bob Wilson. Bob is recently semi-retired, although I'm not really sure I believe that. He's such a curious man. I think he'll be asking questions for all his days. But he's recently semi-retired from Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, where he led programs with the sub-millimeter array, an 8-element radio telescope on Mauna Kea in Hawaii. Bob joined Bell Labs after his PhD and postdoc at Caltech and spent more than 30 years as a researcher and department head and mentor for many, including me. He was my department head for many years. Bob received the Nobel Prize in Physics for his research at Crawford Hill, experimentally verifying the theory of the Big Bang. And next to him is Stephen Chu. Stephen is currently a professor of physics, of molecular and cellular physiology, and of energy science and engineering at Stanford University. That's quite a mouthful, and must keep you very busy. Earlier in his career, he served the United States as Secretary of Energy under President Barack Obama, and among other many accomplishments, created ARPA-E to expand research in energy fields modeled after the successful DARPA programs at the defense area. And this research continues to this day, supporting world-class research in many areas of energy, including some thermal modeling and engineering work that's ongoing here at Bell Labs today. So thank you, Stephen, for that. Stephen joined Bell Labs after his PhD and postdoc at Berkeley and contributed to fundamental research in laser cooling and trapping while at Bell Labs in Homedale. And his work was recognized with the Nobel Prize in 1997. So next to him is Horst Störmer. Horst is professor emeritus at Columbia University. He joined Bell Labs in Murray Hill following his PhD from the University of Stuttgart, performing research here for 20 years. Horst and Daniel Sui experimentally discovered the fractional quantum Hall effect, a new form of quantum fluid seen at low temperatures and very high magnetic fields, for which he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1998. Later, Horst also led the Physical Sciences Research Lab, which is where I knew him from. And next to him, Yann LeCun is the chief AI scientist at Meta and a professor at NYU. Yann joined Bell Labs after a postdoc at the University of Toronto and led a team here in the early days of AI with many advances, including convolutional neural networks. He was recognized for this seminal early work in AI with the 2018 ACM Turing Award, together with Jeffrey Hinton and Yoshua Bengio. And last but certainly not least, as you heard, Al Aho is professor emeritus at Columbia after many, many years leading computer science research here at Murray Hill. Al was recognized with many awards, including the 2020 ACM Turing Award for his work on fundamental algorithms and theory underlying programming language implementation. His algorithm techniques were vital to the development of Unix tools, still pervasive in the industry today. So before I turn it over to each of them for their thoughts on what Bell Labs makes Bell Labs unique, I wanted to reflect on a couple of events that happened to me in the past 10 days that I think say something to the uniqueness of the work that we do at Bell Labs. The first was yesterday, where we had both Eric Schmidt, who's the former CEO of Google, and Andrea Goldsmith, who is the head of the engineering, dean of engineering at Princeton, both of whom have at the top of their resume that, of course, they were Bell Labs interns. And they reflected it, both of them, yesterday. It was really quite fun, on how their experience here has impacted their lives in different ways. Eric was very generous, saying he didn't think he would be here if it wasn't for that time. And in fact, we have touched many people. The second event I wanted to share with you was one last week in San Francisco, where we, some of my team arranged a 2-hour period at the Optical Fiber Conference, which is the premier optical conference every year. And we set aside a time from 12 to 2, so over the lunch hour, for people to come and just talk about if they had an experience at Bell Labs, and to share their experience of Bell Labs and to reflect on Bell Labs at 100. And we expected a couple of hundred people. And in fact, 350 people showed up. It was remarkable. The number was remarkable. What was even more remarkable was the things that people said. The number of people in the optical industry that have been touched by a time here working with us and then moved on to big and better things, or stayed here and became successful, was truly remarkable. And the comments that we got back from these Bell Labs alumni, I like to call them, were very heartwarming and really very true. And I think, again, reflect on the sort of activities and opportunities that you heard from Sean. The ability to bump into people and ask them questions and reflect with them. I know Bob was big on that, and was a mentor to just about the entire Crawford Hill building in that way. So now let me turn it over to our panelists. So, and we'll start with you, Bob. So Bob, you joined Bell Labs in Crawford Hill in the 60s, and you worked there for 30 years. Can you share what research culture was like over the years there at Crawford Hill? It was unique. It was a smaller lab. It wasn't quite the size of Murray Hill. What do you see as the different culture and collaborations there that contributed to the uniqueness of research?
Well, let's see, is this working?
Yes.
Okay. Let me start with a little bit of history.
Okay.
When Bell Labs was formed, there was a real interest in using radio for communications. However, Bell Labs was in New York, in the city, and there was lots of radio noise there. So pretty soon they started making field measurements in New Jersey. By about 1930, they established a single place in Holmdel for research on radio. And in 1928, they hired Karl Jansky, told him to try to understand the sources of noise on radio. Karl set up a rotating directional antenna, discovered the usual thing you might think, man-made noise, thunderstorms both near and far, but there was a hiss-like noise, as he described it, which occurred at about the same time every day. Well, Karl followed this for a year or so. He was not an astronomer, but he figured out it was actually a celestial source. And in the next year, he figured out it came from our galaxy, peaked up at the center of the galaxy. So Karl discovered, whatever word you want to use, radio astronomy. He started radio astronomy. Mm-hmm. I think this is a reflection of not only the attitude there, but probably all of Bell Labs, that when you find something new, you get to the bottom of it. Mm-hmm. You don't just throw it away because, well, it doesn't really matter so much for communications. Mm-hmm. The Holmdel group then went on to work in microwaves. Karl had worked at 20 megahertz, sort of very low frequency from our present standpoint. But they were very instrumental in developing both the hardware and the understanding of microwaves. And as they approached the 40s, they started thinking about radio relay or microwave relay. During the war, they worked on the radar effort. But after the war, they were ready to go with microwave relay. As a teenager in Houston in 1950, microwave relay finally got to Houston, and we got national television. Skipping ahead a little bit, when Bell Labs decided to build the big building in Homedale, the Homedale group wanted to stay together as a small, cohesive group and have access to the outside for their radio. So they had enough clout, I guess, to get a small building built on Crawford Hill, and they moved there. When Bell Labs wanted to get into satellite research, the Crawford Hill group was obviously going to be very important in that. And as you probably know, they built the 20-foot horn reflector with a very low noise receiver. They hired 2 radio astronomers, namely Arno Penzias and me, and gave us the task of spending about half time on radio astronomy and doing something for the Bell system for the other half of the time. Well, Arno was there before I was, and I came in 1963 and started discovering what was going on at Crawford Hill. First, and very important, was Art Crawford's office for lunch. There would be a gathering for lunch every day almost. Crawford Hill was a small place. There was no cafeteria or anything. They would send off to Red Bank for sandwiches, and then we would gather and eat our sandwiches and discussed all sorts of things.
You continued that tradition.
Yes.
Yes, so it was your office when I was there.
Yeah, even things like how to fix your septic tank.
Yes.
However, the important thing was that there were microwave experts there. There were experts in other things. And if I had a problem, that lunchtime was a good time to discuss it. That I was likely to get an answer, someone to volunteer to do something to help, or just simply suggest which direction to go next. So I guess also in the lunch, Rudy Kampfner, who was in a sort of intermediate position between John Pierce and Crawford Hill, would come and tell us about what was going on at Murray Hill. He often had new ideas and would come bounce them off of us. But he was quite an addition to lunch. Another thing I learned was that there were a lot of closets along the hall at Crawford Hill, and there was test equipment of all sorts stuffed away in people's closets that weren't being used. And if I learned where they were, I could find almost any piece of test equipment I needed for a short time and borrow it. And the small group really was quite happy with that sort of thing. That, in addition to sort of intellectual ideas, there were physical things you could borrow. There was a very extensive shop there. In recent years, the shop part of the building got dismantled, but there was an extensive shop, and there were people who knew all about waveguides and microwave equipment. One could make up a sketch of something you wanted. As long as you put the right dimensions on it, they might say, what about this cartoon? But they would make what you wanted. And that's a lovely way to do business if you're an experimenter. At Caltech, when I was a student, the shop was expensive. You had to really be sure that you had to have something from the shop. But at Crawford Hill, you could get what you wanted. It was somehow prepaid. guess it was in the budget at some level. So after the 1965 cosmic microwave background paper, and Arno and I had spent about 5 man-years, I guess, doing radio astronomy. And we got called in and told that, well, here we've seen a lot of radio astronomy. We haven't seen any Bell system work. So maybe you guys ought to do something for the Bell system. So each of us took on a job or two doing propagation measurements. But Arno also had an observing run with the National Radio Astronomy Observatory and learned about the Kitt-Peak antenna, which had been built as a millimeter wave antenna. The person who was going to make receivers for them had left, and they didn't have any good receivers. However, just down the hall was Charlie Burris, who was building the world's best millimeter wave receivers. These were designed for a waveguide system which had been, I think, intellectually thought of back in the early 30s when waveguides were invented. They realized it was possible to make a low-loss millimeter waveguide. Anyway, we asked Charlie if he would make us a mixer for a receiver for the Kitt-Peak antenna. He was very happy to do so. Another indication of the way Bell Labs worked, and I think it had something to do with the merit review system, that people could get credit for contributing across organizational borders.
Yeah.
When I was a student at Caltech, I think we had 1 or 2 discussions with electrical engineering. At Bell Labs, there was open discussion all of the time.
Over lunch.
Over lunch,
Yeah.
or if the person was at Murray Hill, they still were happy to help us.
Yeah.
So Charlie built us a mixer. We incorporated it in a receiver. We took it to Kitt-Peak, and we discovered carbon monoxide in interstellar clouds. That has turned into a big industry. It happens to be the instrument I'm working on now is a millimeter wave instrument, which probably wouldn't have been built if there weren't so many nice molecular signals at 100, 200 gigahertz. So, and I guess the big thing is the ALMA array in northern Chile, which cost, I think, something like $1.4 billion, and one of the biggest and most expensive astronomical instruments ever. Anyway, Crawford Hill was a wonderful place. It was certainly the perfect place for me. The expertise and the cooperation was just wonderful.
And from me as well. Thank you, Bob. So I'm going to go Nobel Turing. So Al, can I turn to you? So Al, you were fortunate to join Bell Labs in computer science research, the research center at the time of great research and discovery and innovation in computer science. You contributed greatly during your period with your research into languages such as awk and computer algorithms, and notably the legendary book that I have on my shelf, The Design and Analysis of Computer Algorithms. Many of us do, I'm sure. A staple in computer science. Can you share your thoughts on the nature of computer science research at Bell Labs during these times as both a researcher and then you were a leader? What was it about Bell Labs? What do you see as unique that led to such productivity at that time?
Well, thank you for the gracious introduction. What I think makes Bell Labs unique, and certainly did in my day, is the people. And let me elaborate on that throughout my talk about some of the interesting denizens I met at Bell Labs. When I look back at the contributions Bell Labs has made in the past 100 years, I am truly amazed. But being a scientist, I'm skeptical. So I wanted to get some affirmation that what was being said by Bell Labs, about Bell Labs and its contributions, was in fact true. So what do you do in this day and age to check if something is true? Well, this may be the worst thing to do. I asked my friendly AI program. And the question I asked them is, this is ChatGPT, if I may reveal it, what have been the most important contributions to science and technology that were made by Bell Labs in the past 100 years? I thought this would be a reasonable test for ChatGPT and for the veracity of all the hullabaloo about Bell Labs. I was very pleased by what ChatGPT said. It started by saying, Bell Labs has been one of the most influential research institutions in science and technology over the past century. Then it included a list of the most important contributions from Bell Labs. The list began, obviously, 1, the transistor, 2, information theory, 3, the laser. Now it started to warm my heart. 4, the Unix operating system. And then 5 and 6, the C and C++ programming languages. ChatGPT continued with many other innovations from Bell Labs, each of which has had major impact on the world of information technology. And we'll hear about some of them, I suspect, from many of the panelists here. I'd like to add a few personal comments to this discussion. Bell Labs hired me in 1967. For me, Bell Labs was the right place at the right time with the right people and supportive management to launch a career in an exciting new area of information science that became to be called computer science. There weren't computer science departments in academia at that time. I had just finished my PhD in formal language theory in the electrical engineering department at Princeton. Doug McElroy, my boss, hired me into the newly created Computing Science Research Center here at Murray Hill. When he hired me, Doug suggested I should work on what I considered important. Wow, what a great job charter. How many times do you get a job charter like that? In addition to this, my good friend and fellow Princeton PhD student, Jeff Ullman, who is here, had joined the Computing Science Research Center a few months earlier. So it was inevitable that I should join the Computing Science Research Center. Jeff and I embarked on our research journey into computer science with 2 forays, one into the design and analysis of computer algorithms, and the other into the design and implementation of programming languages and their compilers. Our research produced theoretical insights, new algorithms, and useful software tools. And it's largely because of the environment in the Computing Science Research Center that we were able to accomplish this. Within 10 years, I had co-authored 40 papers and 5 books, I think almost all with Jeff, on algorithms, data structures, programming languages, and compilers. These papers and books ended up having great impact on the company, academia, and the broader world of computer science. And I'd like to just share with you some of the impact it had on the company because it was a new field and people really didn't understand what computer science was or could contribute. The effort on algorithms was motivated by the fact that algorithms are everywhere. The way I define an algorithm to my mother is that it's a recipe for doing something. Every computer program embodies an algorithm of some kind. one of the great mysteries of life that I'd like to understand better is what kind of algorithm does the human brain use to transform input signals into thoughts and actions? And perhaps my esteemed colleague here can give some insight to this. The research on algorithms, as Todd mentioned, produced a book called The Design Analysis of Computer Algorithms that Jeff and I wrote with my PhD thesis advisor, John Hopcroft. The book showed that powerful design techniques such as divide and conquer and dynamic programming and several others could be applied efficiently to solve large classes of computational problems. Before, the literature often talked about specific algorithms for specific problems. What Doug said was what impressed him about our book was that here we gave a toolkit, a general toolkit for approaching broad classes of problems that every computer programmer should be familiar with. What was also interesting is that this book attracted the attention of Bill Baker, who was president of Bell Labs at that time. He asked me to teach a televised course on algorithms and data structures from this book to software developers throughout Bell Labs. His motivation was to make sure that Bell Labs programmers were using the most efficient algorithms and data structures in the operation support systems that they were creating for the telecommunications industry. And I thought the book and the course were a neat conduit to get new research ideas into company products effortlessly. This is a genius of senior management. In 1975, I found a fast algorithm with Midge Korosik for searching for multiple keywords in parallel in text files. This algorithm, which became known as the Aho-Korosik algorithm, reduced the cost of doing queries to the cost of reading the input tape in a bibliographic search system that Midge had developed for the Bell Labs technical information libraries. Today, this algorithm is used in a variety of places like text editors, bioinformatics, search systems, and intrusion detection systems. When Bill Baker heard about this algorithm, he stopped me one day in the hall and said to me, "Al, keep working on those algorithms. They'll be important someday." I really liked his encouragement, and I think his advice is still apt today. Starting in the late 1960s, Ken Thompson developed the Unix operating system and Dennis Ritchie the C programming language for implementing Unix. Both Ken and Dennis were members of the Computing Science Research Center, and as you're probably well aware, Unix and C were hugely influential in the software industry. Many of today's major software systems are implemented in the C programming language, and the Unix operating system is the predecessor of many major operating systems like Apple's Mac OS and the Linux operating system that are widely used on the internet. So just to wrap up, I'd like to quote one more thing that ChatGPT said, which I thought was very appropriate for this occasion. I might mention, by the way, that when we wrote the design and principles of compiler design book with Jeff, we had a third co-author join us, Ravi Sethi, who worked on a second edition of that book. The compiler's book had a fierce dragon on the front cover that Jeff thought would be a good book cover design. And the book was briefly showed in the Hollywood film Hackers. And my two daughters saw this movie, and it took this scene for them to realize that maybe their old man has done something important. I'd like to conclude just by quoting ChatGPT when it said, Bell Labs has played a foundational role in shaping modern computing, communications, and information systems, with its inventions influencing nearly every aspect of technology today. What a great report card. I hope it's true, and I think it is true after seeing many of the things that have gone on here. And I hope Nokia Bell Labs will get a similar assessment 100 years from now.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Al. So, Steve, your research at the Homedale site was during the early days of lasers and optical communications, a time of great progress and understanding and discoveries, including that of laser trapping, where you performed your research. Could you share your thoughts on the environment in Bell Labs and at Homedale, at the site in Homedale, during your time here, and the qualities that supported you and your team in that research?
Okay, thanks. It's not exactly what you might think. I went to my director, Chuck Shank. I was a department head at the time, and said, Chuck, I've got this great idea on how to make atoms very, very cold. He squinted his eyes, looked at me, and said, well, you got positronium. Positronium is E plus E minus. You got positronium to work. Nobody else could do that. You earned the right to try it, but don't try to get anyone else to help you. Let me try to explain the context of that. The idea of trapping, the real father of that was Art Ashkin, who had been at Homedale for many, many years, starting in the middle of the 1960s. His dream, he discovered how to trap particles in water and levitate them in air and things like that. And by 1978, he wrote a paper. By the early 70s, he was thinking about, can you do this with atoms? 1978, wrote a seminal paper, but it came out in 78. About that time, 79, work had stopped because, from 70 to 78, to pursue the trapping of particles and then atoms is an eternity at Bell Labs, and they weren't making progress. And so Chuck said, "Look, it's great that you tried, but you got to move on." So he closed it down. I arrived at Homedale. I was in Murray Hill in 78. Arrived in Homedale. Chuck had recruited me to be a new department head there in 83. Art landed on me as soon as I came there and started to say, well, why don't you try this? I looked at his paper and said, no, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. Anyway, and finally, so what happened is I found this laser cooling thing accidentally, rediscovered it quite candidly, and then I started to scrounge around. Then I talked to Chuck. He said, okay, you can try it. Scrounge around for a vacuum chamber that was destined to a university on surpluses, and you can stop the gift, which I did. And within a year, less than a year from the time I scrounged the vacuum chamber and had the idea, I wrote the paper for optical molasses. But during that time, to give you a flavor of what it was like, I said, okay, I need to slow the atoms down before they can be put in these counter-propagating beams. I wanted an electro-optic modulator. My idea was to send light into a laser into this electro-optic modulator, put in a radio frequency sideband. So I went around and said, okay, how do we do this? I went to Rod Alfernus. He goes in his drawer and he says, there's a 1 by 1 millimeter by, 4 or 5 centimeter long lithium niobate. Here, have one of these. Reaches into another drawer and says, here, this is high frequency stuff. It's in the gigahertz range. You'll need SMA launchers. And then I said, so then I was reading a book by Ivan Kamenau, who wrote the Bible on electro-optic modulators, and so I was embedded in this stuff. So I was able to put together with my own hands an electro-optic modulator in a couple weeks. Literally, here, going, I put gold coatings on this, got the SMA launchers, and my postdoc put in a high gigahertz difference frequency modulator, and so we were off and running. But it gives you a flavor for being able to tap into the deep resources intellectually within Bell Labs. The same thing was occurring when I showed up in Murray Hill. Phil Anderson just got his Nobel Prize, and he said, the best, and Anderson localization, he made many contributions to condensed matter physics, but Anderson localization, you know, his first beginning to think deeply about how to think about disordered solids. I said the best example of Anderson localization was an experiment that Stan Geschwin had done, and I appeared, and Hyatt Gibbs said, well, you know, we can make it a little bit better, but he only tuned one with a ruby laser. We can tune the other side with a dye laser. Why don't you join? And so Hyatt and I, and with Sam McCall, started doing this. And lo and behold, we found out that the experiment was wrong. This is a null result. And we later did another experiment that shows it wasn't energy transfer through exchange. It was a dipole-dipole transfer, so localization, it was long range, so localization didn't even apply. But it again gave this feeling that there was this intellectual power. You know, Sam McCall, Hyatt Gibbs were brilliant, brilliant scientists. And Stan was really great about this. He said, here are my, you know, we couldn't duplicate it, so here are my samples. What, you know, what else do you need? And so he was not defensive at all. Again, this, you know, the feeling that, you know, we were seeking the truth, and the feeling we, you know, of everybody trying to help each other. And this really affected everything I did about science, everything I knew about science. I went to Bell Labs. I was actually in official leave of absence from University of California, Berkeley. I was a graduate student postdoc. For whatever reason, they made me an assistant professor before I published a single scientific paper. I don't think that would be done today. Actually, it wouldn't have been done. I don't know what they were doing, thinking, what they were smoking. But in any case, but they said, because you've spent all your time at Berkeley working on the same experiment, you know, why don't you're also allowed to go out somewhere. And says, okay, I'm going to go to Bell Labs, come there, talk about what I did, and they asked me, okay, what do you want to do? If you come here, what do you want to do? I gave an elaborate explanation of an improved experiment. And Bill Brinkman tells me later, he says, oh my God, we thought, you know, we had lined up 2 days of interviews. Do we really want to talk to this person? If he wants to do his thesis over and over and over again. And then it was only after the first 2 interviews, they decided they were going to keep him, because he said, the guy's got an open mind. You know, he's willing, but he didn't know, and to show you how bad it was, I would appear and they would say, wow, I'm interested in antiferromagnetism, da-da-da. And the first question I ask is, what's antiferromagnetism? But anyway, Bell Labs hired me, and it was opening up the world to all this wonderful stuff. And so it transformed my life, my way of thinking, my way of doing science. And the one final thought is, after I went to university, there's a whole flux of people. I left in 1987. By 1987 through 91, 92, or 86, and these Bell Labs were landing in all sorts of places. And one person said, you know, the people, if we can go to the universities and talk to people, you can tell the people who used to spend some time at Bell Labs were qualitatively different than the rest of the faculty. Yeah. It meant in a very good way. Yeah. They were much more interactive, they were much more open, and they were much more willing to think of wider context of things. And that's something I learned also at Bell Laboratories.
Absolutely. Thank you, Steve. So Yann, research at Bell Labs has a benefit over our academic partners in that we benefit from the fact that we're part of a company. And the company brings us real-world problems to solve, something that you did with the first applications of early AI solutions, such as convolutional neural networks, to the challenge of, at that time, character recognition, which was a big problem that needed to be solved. Could you share your thoughts on the unique environment you found in computer science at Bell Labs and how you and your colleagues performed your research to solve these real-world problems.
So first of all, the interesting thing is that the lab I joined at Bell Labs in Holmdel in 1988 was in the corridor next to Steve Chu's former lab. He had left just 1 year before I joined. And my department was all physicists. And I'm like you, I'm an electrical engineer. I'm playing a computer scientist on TV, but I never actually studied computer science. It's a terrible confession I have to make. And all my colleagues at Bell Labs were all physicists. I was in Larry Jackel's department. Anyway, the first story I have to tell you about Bell Labs, my first contact with Bell Labs is that I was a PhD student in France, and I went to my first international workshop conference in the French Alps, mostly with physicists and neuroscientists, mathematicians, and etc. And there were two people, one of whom was a kind of cowboy-looking guy with cowboy boots, and he had like sideburns and everything. He was very young, and he kept, independently of who was giving a talk, he kept asking very nasty questions to that person. It could have been a Nobel Prize winner. He didn't give a shit. He was, waiting for the end of the talk, raising his hand, and then asking a horrible question that would bring down the entire talk, right? So I asked my colleague next to me, said, who are these guys? Oh, they're from Bell Labs. Visibly, they had some experience. He had just joined Bell Labs, actually. His name was John Denker. I'm sure some of you...
You worked with him later. You wrote papers with him.
Well, that's not all of Bell Labs.
No. Okay, so I had to give a talk at this workshop, right? It was my first talk in English. My English was terrible. It's still not so great, but it was very terrible at the time. And so I gave a talk about neural nets. Most people were interested in that at the time. John Hopfield was there too. And I give this talk in broken English. Nobody understands what I'm saying. There's big silence at the end of my talk. And John Denker raises his hand. And I literally liquefy on place, right? You've seen this movie, Emily, right? She sees her, future lover or whatever, the guy she has a crush on, and he enters the bar, and she goes, liquid. I went, liquid. And he said something nice. And 2 years later, they hired me. So before I joined, I was a postdoc in Toronto, and my future department head, Larry Jackel, asked me, okay, we'd like to buy a computer for you before you come, so it's ready when you come. So this was, before the summer 1988. And I said, well, here in Toronto, we have this great new thing. It's called a Sun 4. And it's really fast, and we can do floating point calculation, we can train neural net. It's really great. I said, okay. And then I get to Bell Labs a few months later, and there's a Sun 4. But there's a Sun 4 just for me. The Sun 4 in Toronto was for like 40 people. The entire department was on it, right? So I asked Larry, what's the deal? He says, at Bell Labs, you don't get famous by saving money. Okay, I love this place. So, start working on neural nets, convolutional nets, and stuff like that. Larry, liked shooting videos for some reason, so he had this new 8mm, kind of camera. So he said, we have to build a demo of your character recognition system. And so we put together a system. It had a camera. We could put a piece of paper underneath, and it would take a picture and recognize the characters. We took that demo to some VP somewhere inside AT&T, and the VP looked at it and said, well, that's nice. Can you guys add the numbers now? I said, okay, that's going to be a difficult job to kind of convince the VPs that this could be useful. But eventually, we found partners in the development area at Bell Labs, and they turned this into products, and we were not interested in recognizing characters. What we were after was really building intelligent machines. And the group I was in started out, Larry Jekyll, when he became a department head, went to see John Hopfield and asked John Hopfield, I have a new department, what should I do? And John Hopfield told him, you should build hardware neural nets. That's what he did. He started building resistor arrays, analog chips to basically run neural nets, and quickly realized they had to be programmable and digital and all that stuff, and then quickly realized Hopfield nets are not actually that useful, even though you can win Nobel Prizes with it. You need to use kind of slightly more sophisticated things, so they started thinking about that and hired people like me. I was the only fake computer scientist in the lab. All the other ones were physicists, and then the year after me, we hired a gentleman called Vladimir Vapnik, who's a mathematician. So we had in the group device physicists. We had a statistical physicist as well, Sarah Soya, and we had fake computer scientists like me, and chip designers, and a mathematician, and we had more theoreticians and mathematicians and algorithms people as we went. One story about Vladimir Vapnik is interesting. He was hired in the group in 1989, and he was from the USSR, and at the time this was before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so he didn't have a green card, and so we had to accompany him to the bathroom. He was not authorized to walk around the corridor by himself, and his computer was not connected to the network because there would have been a security breach for some reason. So there was a lot of restrictions. Eventually, he got a green card, and he started writing a book, theoretical book about machine learning, which is actually a very famous book now. And at some point, he'd never seen a computer before, and he had a Sun workstation on his desk. So some of us kind of taught him how to use Unix and LaTeX and Emacs, and things like that. And one day, one of my colleagues, Léon Boutou, kind of walks past his office, and he's kind of has a printout of his book, and he has his finger on the backspace key of the keyboard, just sitting on it, on the key. And so Léon is a little kind of perturbed and sort of get into his office and ask him, like, what are you doing? He says, well, I want to like swap the order of those two chapters. And so he was actually erasing a chapter and was going to retype it in the other place. And so, he was a mathematician who never touched a computer. So Léon sat down with him and said, there is this thing, control space, and then, control W, and then you can go to the place you want, and you control Y, and, cut and paste, copy, paste. And he said, with his Russian accent, that's great. So then he and I and a colleague, Astor Levin, started doing experiments about verifying whether his theories were right, which he had never bothered to do. Of course, he didn't have a computer. And so trying to figure out whether when you train a machine and you increase the number of training samples, whereas the error on the training set and the test set converge to each other, and at what speed, and whether his theory was predicting to some extent the speed at which they converge. And so I program the thing, and I do an experiment, and the curve doesn't quite fit the theory. And this was on a Friday, and I show the result to him, and I say, I kind of tweak the formula you gave me, and if there's a square root in it, and if I remove the square root, it just fits, like really well. I say, that's wrong. And then this was on a Friday. And then on Sunday afternoon, he calls me on the phone, very excited, and he says, I remove square root. So we had figured out, sort of a different approach to the thing, and now the curve was fitting. And so on Monday, we meet at the labs, and he said, in Russia, if we'd done this in Russia, we would go out and get drunk for a week. So I learned a huge amount at at Bell Labs, the fact that in practice, when it's kind of counterintuitive to some extent that the intellectual impact that this place has had on the world of science and technology and through publications, right? And why would an industrial research lab publish? I've seen how it's practiced in other companies, and most of them tend to be a little more secretive. And in fact, there is a huge psychological effect of publishing your work, which is that you tell the world, like, we're just better than you. Okay, and you see this in one of Feynman's book when he explained the same thing, that when you talk about something, you kind of impress them, and they want to work for you. Or they abandon whatever it is they're doing. So the open research, not only is good for the company because of their reputation and the impact on the world, but also because you can attract good people by doing this. You can't tell, good scientists come here, but you can't talk about what you do because you kill their career when you do this, right? And I learned that. It was very good lesson. At the split with Lucent, I went with AT&T Labs because the person who became the president of Bell Labs at the time absolutely hated neural nets, machine learning, and AI. So everybody working on machine learning, neural nets, and AI actually went with AT&T Labs, not Bell Labs. And at the time, Bell Labs for many years really had very, very few people working on AI. We were talking about this with Sean earlier. Thankfully, that's not the case anymore. So then I joined academia. I became a professor at NYU. And in 2013, Mark Zuckerberg approached me because he wanted to start a research activity in AI. And I could have, done similar things at Google or other companies. But Google already had a research culture, and it was very different from Bell Labs, and I didn't like it. I had a bunch of former colleagues from Bell Labs who had gone to Google with the idea of changing the culture and really were completely unsuccessful. So I told Mark Zuckerberg, I said, okay, I only have 3 conditions, or 4. 3 conditions. One is I don't quit my job at NYU, so I'll be part-time. Second is I don't move from New York. I'm not going to California. I can, but I'll have to divorce. And third, we have to practice open research, publish everything we do, even open source or code, which AT&T wasn't doing, actually, when I was there. But because that's the best way to sort of get everybody to contribute to the stuff that we think is important. And he said, oh, you don't have to worry about that. It's already in our DNA. We open source all of our platform software, blah, blah, blah. So no problem. I said, that's great. That's where I want to be. And then he gave me carte blanche to start a research lab and build a culture from scratch. And I said, what a great opportunity. And I basically tried to reproduce a lot of the culture that I saw at Bell Labs. So you can think of Meta's fundamental AI research fair as basically a baby Bell Labs. It's been around for 11 years now. There's about 600 people. I don't run it anymore. I only run it for 4 years. I hate running things, and I'm terrible at it, so it's a good thing. I have the best job in the company because I'm senior VP, but I don't have anybody reporting to me. And so that really, the impact of Bell Labs is not just direct, not just indirect through publication and technology, but also indirect through kind of the spirit of Bell Labs and sort of the descendant of it.
Thank you. Certainly agree with you that open publishing is a burnish the thought leadership that Bell Labs has, and it's important for Nokia to have that because it's valuable to in the industry. But it also, for me, is the way we attract best talent, and so that it continues to be the big challenge for us. So finally, last but not least, Horst. So Horst, you led the physical research lab in the latter half of your time here at Bell Labs. Can you share the way of working that you promoted in your own research and that of your teams while you were here?
Yeah. This is on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm the last speaker and I get the hard questions. Well, actually, before I make my wise remarks, let me point out that physicists have really bad memories. It's actually the reason why they become physicists. Because they think they can just squeeze everything in a few equations. That's the only thing they can remember. And then the rest they just derive from it. That works in some circumstances quite okay, but in others just hopefully poor. And I think this is one of these hopefully poor occasions to derive. You have to really try to remember. On the other hand, I think the answer to your question is very easy. Hire the best people in the world, put them all together as tightly as you can, and make sure they work. I think that is what you need to do in order to have a fantastic organization, research organization. And I think that's what I learned at Bell Labs, and that's what I tried to continue to do while I was director at Bell Labs. And that's what I see you are trying also to do here. So now, this sounds very easy, but I think each of these components can be very difficult. How do you find the best people in the world? And there I would say it's like the words from real estate, location, location, location. I think it is reputation, reputation, reputation. The reason I came here to Bell Labs from Germany was because that was the best place in the world where I could do the kind of research that I wanted to do, condensed matter physics. So I'm speaking about the physics part. It was the reputation of Bell Labs that brought me. It was the people that were here. It was the people whose papers I wrote in Germany. It was just the name Bell Labs that just said everything about research in my research area and actually in others, as you have heard. So I think reputation is the most important thing, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir. And it's very hard to first establish it. That was a good part about it. I mean, once we joined Bell Labs, we were at the place that had a fantastic reputation. So when I became director, I didn't have to work on the reputation of Bell Labs anymore. I had to maintain it and continue to foster it. But the reputation was here. So this, I think, is the most important thing. Then, of course, it doesn't hurt to have scouts going out to university, because those are the places from where you get the smartest people from around the world. Scouts that go out and give talks. You're present at international conferences. You find the young people. It's not hard to find the young people, in fact, because basically they're standing in line. They want to come to Bell Labs. This is attractive to them. If you want to get the smartest people in the world, you start out with a fantastic organization, and you don't have to do much about it. You get the smartest people knocking onto your door. And there's another aspect of this. As Yann LeCun just pointed out, there's lots of researchers from Bell Labs that went out into the university. Yesterday we saw it. The people on the panel, they all had a little bit to do with Bell Labs at some point, some actually more than others. And those are the people that sent to you the best students they have. They instill into their students and postdoc the desire to come here. This is Bell Labs, go there. So I think this is another very important aspect of what Bell Labs has done. You go around the country, actually you're going around the world. My thesis advisor, that's how I got to Bell Labs. My thesis advisor was working with Shockley here. He went with Shockley to the West Coast. Then he went back to Germany, became a professor. I became a student, one of 100 students at some point. And he always told me, Horst, actually, Germany, Mr. Störmer, finish up your PhD as quickly as you can and then go to the United States, and I'm trying to get you into Bell Labs. That's what finally happened. I mean, I came here because of the connections. They checked me out. It wasn't that I just trusted his word. They checked me out, and I was above threshold, barely above threshold. But I made it into Bell Labs, and the reason I came, because it was the mecca of my field. All of the high priests were here. You walk down the corridor and you look at these nameplates. When I came here, look at this. Oh, my goodness. Phil Anderson, right? This is John Hansel. I mean, I knew all these names. So again, I think it is reputation, reputation, reputation. The second one, what do you do? I mean, once I came here, I was offered a 2-bay short, I think. I'm not sure whether it still exists. This is the size of the laboratory. It's not very big. I don't know, 16 square meters, or what is it? 160 square feet, something like this. You got an empty room, you got a desk, you got some money, and you were basically told, do what you want to do, with boundary conditions. We couldn't do everything. We weren't doing biology, except biology as it relates to computation. But there were fields that were not covered, and this was clear. The central part of it was condensed matter physics, and I was right in there. I didn't know anything else anyway, so it was clear that I'm going to steer a direction that was in the interest of Bell Labs, of AT&T. So there weren't many boundary conditions. Basically, we could do what we wanted. And look, Yann LeCun was surrounded by physicists, right? And what developed from there. What I finally did is something that is, well, we stumbled over this fractional quantum Hall effect. It wasn't clear at all what this was good for. It was wonderful physics, wonderful physics. We got all of the theorists excited about this, and there were papers written in there still. But look, well, it's not there anymore, right? So nowadays, we didn't know what to do with it. But nowadays, it could be the basis of fault-tolerant quantum computing. That's what Bob Willett here is working on, and this is what Nokia Bell Labs is pointing out as one of their basic, their important research direction. It could be that this actually is useful for something, and not just useful, it could actually be revolutionary. We don't know yet. So, right, you have to make it as wide as possible as you can, but not too wide. And that's, of course, a very, very difficult judgment. How wide can you, how many sigmas do we allow? And very often from the far ends, there's another one. From the far ends, there are technologies coming or discoveries coming in that really have a revolutionary impact on the world. The third one is, make sure that they work. For most people, for excellent people that you have hired, this is almost never a problem. These people are self-driven. I was telling earlier over lunch, for two of my scientists, they're not my scientists. Nobody ever worked for me. I was always working for them. There were two people in my lab that came in early in the morning, and they were working together. And in order to check out, early in the morning, 4 o'clock. And in order to check out who came at what time, they felt each other's tailpipe on the car. When did he come? Is it still warm? So they are driven. So you don't have to monitor closely. What I try to do as a department and also as a director, I try to also be a little bit an example. I continue doing my own research. And there were two reasons. For one of them, I wanted to be part of what they were doing. The second thing is, I wanted to be reminded every day how hard it is, right? Research, fundamental research engineering, it's hard. And I wanted to just be still in the same camp and experience every day how hard it is, because when I had to judge ultimately what other people were doing, I want to have continue to have a feel for this. The other thing I try to do is, again, something that's I'm not the only one, is management by walking around. So here I'm in the telephone company that does communication, and I think I never placed a telephone call to any of the people in my lab or in my department. I walked there. And by walking there, I bumped into a lot of people that I could talk to. I was visible on the corridor. I didn't sit back in my office filling out forms. I wanted to talk to the individual. I wanted to get a feel for what they were doing, because again, at the end of it, and we're getting to this, I had to judge them. And not only I, but together with my department heads. And very often, and that's a funny story, very often, these labs were so small that very often there wasn't another chair. There was just one chair in front of a desk. The equipment was right behind. You didn't have an office, at least for a few years. You were sitting right next to your dilution refrigerator. Bob, where are you? And there was no other chair. So when I came in, I sat on the garbage can. And that is a great experience. You sit actually 5 inches lower than the person you're talking to, and you just listen. You don't talk. You don't tell anybody of 100 people that you hired the smartest people in the world and believe that you are smarter than them. That's just impossible. You're just there for learning. So I was sitting on the small stool and listened to what was going on. So the last thing, performance review. And I suppose you still have it. Performance review was the hardest part of the year. So for 1 week, together with, when I was director, but as a department head, we were all locked up in a room, and we went through the accomplishments of the employees, of the MTS, members of technical staff, and their assistant, AMTS, everybody. So it's about 100 people. We went through them, what they had performed, how their performance was the last year. And it was the department head that had to present the case, and then it was the other department heads that asked deep questions, really. And in this way, we established an order of the people that were on the top, never mind 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the top performers, the middle performers, and the not so good performers. This was a tough week. It was so tough that at the end of this week, we all got together and got drunk. Because you had to make friends again. You made enemies during this week. But in this way, the department heads, as well as I, we had to understand what everybody was doing. We had to know what they are. And this was important because by them understanding what everybody does, they could have some impact on guiding, not telling what to do, but guiding them, saying, this also came out of performance review. Feedback. This is great, but wouldn't you want to do this and that? Wouldn't you want to collaborate with X and Y, although that is actually happened largely on the corridors by themselves, and I think I should mention that once again. The collaboration is an extraordinary part at Bell Labs. The best time during the day was lunch. There were round tables with 10, 12 people around it that assembled sort of in an irregular way. It wasn't prepared, that always the same people were sitting together. It was just random. There were random people, most of them knew each other, but I mean, a few hundred people, so you know everybody. And there you heard the news. You heard what somebody just had done. You heard what somebody just had read. And very often, 2 people then walk back together down the corridor, still talking about something, and say, hey, you should come over to my lab. I have some equipment for you. So that part, lunch part, but also the density of people. I very much believe in a high density. And so there were small labs. People were just bumping into each other all the time. The corridors were the places of exchange of ideas. At least, I mean, the sparks of ideas. And then pull somebody in and say, can you say that again? I think I was thinking about this. So, okay, let me, what are we, 9 minutes over?
Yep.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so let me say again. no doubt about it, right? Hire the smartest people on Earth, not just in the United States, on Earth. When we sat around the lunch table, there were always more than half of people who were not born in the United States, probably still like. Actually, today when I walked around in these different presentations, I noticed this is still like this, right? Everybody has an accent, including me. So it is hire the smartest people in the world, sure. Put them all together densely. Nobody had a lab big enough so that he could accumulate all sort of instruments. It was called building empires. Don't do this. Work with somebody else that is an expert on the other instrument. And the last thing is just make sure that they work. But all together, reputation. And don't let it slip. Once you lost it, it takes generations to build it up again. And I'm sure you understand this. This is the most important. Keep up the reputation of Bell Labs. It is essential.
Yeah. Thank you, Horst. So as Horst mentioned, we are running a little bit over our time, so we won't have time for some Q&A. However, do the Bell Labs thing. And at the break, if you have a question for any of our panelists, please feel free to go up and ask them. I'm sure that they are welcome and able to take your questions. So thanks. Please join me in thanking the group again.